Every death leaves behind questions. Most are answered quickly. Others take months. Some take years. But every once in a while, a case emerges where the questions refuse to stay buried. A case where the official explanation is not enough. A case where investigators, lawyers, judges, and grieving families find themselves staring at the same evidence and seeing very different things. This is one of those cases. A young woman is dead. A family is searching for answers. An accused man stands at the center of a growing legal storm. And a courtroom is forced to confront a question that should have already been settled. What really happened? Because when a person dies under circumstances serious enough to trigger a criminal investigation, the forensic evidence is supposed to provide clarity. It is supposed to narrow uncertainty. It is supposed to answer questions. Do not create new ones. Yet in this case, the questions only seem to multiply. As investigators worked to reconstruct the final moments of Twisha's life, the story began attracting national attention. News channels followed every development. Social media erupted with theories. Public opinion formed quickly. But inside the courtroom, something far more significant was unfolding. Judges were examining the evidence. Lawyers were challenging conclusions. And the legal process was moving in a direction few expected, because this was no longer just a debate about allegations. It was becoming a debate about the evidence itself, about what had been examined, what had been overlooked, and whether the complete truth had actually been uncovered. Then came a decision that changed everything. The court approved a second post-mortem examination. For many observers, that single decision raised an unsettling possibility. What if critical questions remained unanswered? What if the first examination had not resolved every uncertainty? And what exactly had convinced the court that another forensic review was necessary? Those questions transformed this case from a criminal investigation into something much larger, a battle over facts, a battle over evidence, and a battle over the search for truth. But perhaps the most important question wasn't directed at investigators or lawyers, or even the accused. It was directed at the evidence itself, because evidence does not care about public opinion. It does not care about headlines. It does not care about social media debates. It tells its story one fact at a time, and in the Twisha case, that story remains incomplete. Today, we examine the investigation, the courtroom battles, the disputed questions, and the extraordinary decision that brought forensic evidence back to the center of the case. Not speculation, not a rumor, not assumptions. Only the events, the evidence, and the questions that remain. Every major case begins with a moment. A single event that changes lives forever. For one family, that moment was the loss of a young woman named Twisha. What began as a tragedy soon evolved into something much larger. A criminal investigation, a public controversy, and eventually, one of the most closely watched legal battles in the country. In the days that followed Twisha's death, information began emerging piece by piece. Questions surfaced almost immediately. Family members sought clarity. Friends searched for answers. And as news organizations started reporting on the case, public interest grew at a remarkable pace. At first, many believed the investigation would follow a familiar path. Authorities would gather evidence. Forensic experts would examine the available findings. Investigators would reconstruct the final timeline. And eventually, the facts would provide a clear picture of what had happened. But that is not how this story unfolded. Instead of reducing uncertainty, each new development seemed to generate even more questions. News broadcasts began dedicating extensive coverage to the case. Online discussions exploded. Millions of people who had never met Twisha suddenly found themselves following every update, every statement, and every courtroom development. Some demanded immediate answers, others urged patience. Many simply wanted to understand how a young woman's death had become the center of a national debate. As public attention intensified, investigators continued their work behind the scenes. Evidence was collected, statements were reviewed, timelines were examined. Medical findings became a central focus. While the public consumed headlines, investigators faced a far more difficult task: separating fact from speculation. Because high-profile cases often create an environment where rumors travel faster than evidence. Every statement is analyzed, every detail is debated, every development becomes a headline. Yet the investigation itself moves much more slowly. One document at a time, one witness at a time, one piece of evidence at a time. As weeks passed, the case became increasingly complex. Lawyers representing different interests began preparing for what was shaping up to be a significant legal battle. Arguments were being developed. Evidence was being challenged. Questions were being raised about the investigation itself. And gradually, attention began shifting toward one individual, a name that would soon dominate headlines, television debates, and courtroom proceedings: Samarth Singh. As scrutiny intensified, legal proceedings accelerated. The public wanted answers. The family wanted answers. Investigators were still searching for answers, and the courts were preparing to examine the evidence that would ultimately shape the future of the case. What happened next would transform an already controversial investigation into a national story, because the battle was no longer confined to police files. It was moving into the courtroom, and some of the most significant developments were still ahead. In every major investigation, there comes a point when speculation must give way to evidence. For investigators handling the Twisha case, that process had already begun. Behind closed doors, officers were working to reconstruct a timeline. They were collecting statements, reviewing available records, examining forensic findings, and attempting to determine exactly what had happened in the days and hours leading up to Twisha's death. From the outside, it appeared to be a routine investigative process, but the intense public attention surrounding the case ensured that every development would be scrutinized, every statement, every procedural step, every delay. As news coverage expanded, so did public interest. Questions began circulating across television studios, online forums, and social media platforms. How far had the investigation progressed? What evidence had been collected? And perhaps most importantly, were investigators pursuing every possible lead? Authorities maintained that the investigation was active and ongoing. Police officials repeatedly stated that evidence was being reviewed and that investigative procedures were continuing according to protocol. But public confidence is often tested when information is limited. And in high-profile cases, unanswered questions can quickly generate controversy. As the days passed, criticism began to grow. Some observers questioned the pace of the investigation. Others focused on inconsistencies they believed required further examination. Still, others demanded greater transparency from authorities. The debate was no longer limited to what had happened to Twisha. It was increasingly becoming a debate about the investigation itself. Then another issue entered the spotlight: cooperation. During public statements, police officials addressed what they described as challenges encountered during the investigation. According to reports, authorities claimed that notices had been issued to certain individuals connected to the case. Officials later alleged that not everyone had fully cooperated with those requests. Those allegations quickly became a subject of public discussion. Supporters of the investigation argued that cooperation was essential for establishing the facts. Others questioned the circumstances surrounding the notices and the claims being made. what might have been a routine procedural issue suddenly became another point of controversy. And with each new statement, public attention intensified. The investigation was now unfolding on two fronts, one inside police files, the other in the court of public opinion. Investigators continued gathering evidence. But outside official channels, competing narratives were already forming. Media coverage expanded. Legal representatives began responding publicly, and questions about accountability became increasingly difficult to ignore. For authorities, the challenge was clear. They needed to follow the evidence wherever it led while navigating the enormous pressure generated by a case that had captured national attention. But as investigators worked to move forward, another battle was beginning to take shape. A legal battle. One that would shift the focus from police headquarters to the courtroom. Because soon, judges would be asked to weigh critical arguments. Arguments involving evidence. Arguments involving procedure. And arguments that could significantly alter the direction of the case. The investigation was far, far from over. In many ways, it was only entering its most consequential phase. As investigators continued their work behind the scenes, the focus of the Twisha case began shifting to a different arena. The courtroom. For weeks, public attention had centered on the investigation. Now, judges would be asked to examine some of the most important questions raised by the case. The stakes were high. For prosecutors, the goal was to demonstrate that the investigation needed to continue without interference. For the defense, the objective was different. They sought relief through the legal process, challenging aspects of the case and arguing their position before the court. As word of the hearing spread, public interest intensified once again. News organizations closely monitored every development. Legal analysts weighed in with competing interpretations, and supporters on different sides of the debate waited anxiously for the court's decision. Inside the courtroom, arguments were presented. Documents were reviewed, submissions were examined, and the judge was tasked with evaluating the information placed before the court. Outside, speculation continued to grow. But inside, the standard was different. The court was not concerned with rumors. It was concerned with evidence, procedure, and the law. One of the most closely watched developments involved the bail request submitted on behalf of Samarth Singh. The hearing became a defining moment in the case. For many observers, the court's decision would indicate how seriously the allegations, investigative findings were being viewed at that stage of the proceedings. After considering the submissions, the court denied bail. The decision immediately became headline news. Supporters of the investigation viewed the ruling as a significant development. Others emphasized that a denial of bail does not determine guilt or innocence. Instead, it reflects the court's assessment of the circumstances at that particular stage of the legal process. Yet even as attention focused on the bail decision, another issue was quietly emerging. An issue that would soon overshadow everything else. The forensic evidence. Questions regarding medical findings had already been circulating. Family members had continued seeking clarity. Legal representatives had raised concerns. And the court was now being asked to consider whether further examination was necessary. What happened next surprised many observers, because the courtroom was no longer discussing only custody or procedural matters. It was beginning to examine whether additional forensic scrutiny was required, and that question carried enormous significance. Forensic evidence often forms the foundation of a criminal investigation. It can confirm theories, challenge assumptions, and sometimes reveal entirely new questions. As legal arguments continued, attention increasingly shifted toward the medical evidence itself. What did the existing findings show? What questions remained unresolved? And Could additional examination provide answers that had not yet been discovered? The court's response would become one of the most important developments in the entire case. A decision that transformed the conversation. A decision that reignited public debate. And a decision that would place forensic evidence at the very center of the Twisha investigation. In criminal investigations, few pieces of evidence carry more weight than forensic findings. Witnesses can forget details. Memories can fade. Accounts can conflict. But forensic evidence is often viewed as the silent witness. A witness that cannot be influenced by public opinion. A witness that cannot be persuaded. A witness whose role is simply to reveal facts. That is why one of the most significant developments in the Twisha case came not from a police statement, not from a press conference, and not from a television debate. It came from the courtroom. As legal proceedings continued, attention increasingly shifted toward the medical evidence surrounding Twisha's death. Questions had been raised, concerns had been voiced, and legal representatives argued that further examination was necessary. The court listened, reviewed submissions, considered the arguments, and then issued a decision that would immediately change the direction of the case. A second post-mortem examination would be permitted. For many members of the public, the announcement came as a surprise. After all, post-mortem examinations are intended to help determine the medical facts surrounding a death. Why would another examination be necessary? The answer lies in the purpose of the legal system itself. Courts are not tasked with defending conclusions. They are tasked with examining them. And when significant questions remain unresolved, judges sometimes authorize additional forensic review in the interest of clarity. It is important to understand what a second post-mortem does and what it does not do. It does not automatically prove that an earlier examination was incorrect. It does not establish guilt, and it does not determine the outcome of a criminal case. Instead, it represents an effort to gather additional information, to revisit unanswered questions, and to ensure that the conclusions eventually reached are based on the most complete evidence available. For Twisha's family, the decision carried enormous significance. For months, they had continued seeking answers. The court's order was viewed by many supporters as an opportunity for greater scrutiny and transparency. But while some celebrated the decision, others urged caution, because a second examination is not a verdict, it is a process. A process designed to uncover facts rather than confirm assumptions. As news of the order spread, public interest surged once again. Television panels debated its implications. Legal commentators analyzed the ruling. Social media users offered countless theories. Yet amid the noise, one reality remained unchanged. The investigation was still ongoing. The questions were still being examined, and the final answers had not yet emerged. Forensic experts now faced an important responsibility: to conduct their work with precision, to follow the evidence wherever it led, and to provide findings that could withstand scrutiny from investigators, lawyers, and the courts. Because every detail mattered, every observation mattered, every conclusion mattered. The stakes could not have been higher, not only for the investigation, but for public confidence in the justice process itself. The court's decision had effectively reopened one of the most important aspects of the case. And in doing so, it raised a larger question. If additional forensic examination was necessary, what unanswered issues had convinced the court that a second review was warranted? That question would continue to loom over the investigation. And as the legal battle intensified, another force was beginning to shape the future of the case: public pressure, the demands of a grieving family, the attention of a nation, and the growing expectation that every remaining question would eventually be answered. As the investigation continued and legal proceedings moved forward, another force began shaping the story. Public attention. What had started as a criminal investigation had now become something much larger, a national conversation. Across television networks, newspapers, online platforms, and social media, people were discussing the same question. What really happened to Twisha? For her family, however, the case was never about headlines. It was personal. Behind every court filing, behind every news report, and behind every legal argument was the loss of a loved one. While investigators worked through evidence and procedures, Twisha's family continued to seek what they believed was still missing. Answers. They spoke publicly. They challenged aspects of the investigation. And they continued calling for complete transparency regarding the circumstances surrounding her death. Their concerns resonated with thousands of people across the country. Many followed the case closely. Some organized online campaigns. Others participated in public demonstrations. And with each new development, public interest continued to grow. The courtroom was no longer the only place where the case was being debated. The discussion had expanded far beyond legal proceedings. Every hearing generated headlines. Every official statement was analyzed. Every court order became the subject of intense discussion. The public wanted clarity, and many wanted it immediately. But criminal investigations rarely move at the speed of public expectation. Evidence takes time to examine. Witness statements require verification. Forensic findings must be reviewed carefully. And legal procedures often move much more slowly than public opinion. This created a growing tension. On one side stood a family seeking answers. On the other hand, stood a justice system attempting to follow established procedures. Both were focused on the same objective: the truth. But the path toward that truth was becoming increasingly complicated. As media coverage intensified, so did speculation. Television debates offered competing theories. Online discussions produced countless interpretations. Supporters and critics often reached dramatically different conclusions based on the same limited information. For investigators, this created a difficult challenge, because public attention can help keep a case in the spotlight, but it can also generate pressure that threatens to overshadow the evidence itself. The responsibility of investigators is not to follow public opinion. It is to follow facts. The responsibility of courts is not to respond to social media trends. It is to evaluate evidence. And the responsibility of forensic experts is not to satisfy public expectations. It is to determine what the evidence can actually support. That distinction is crucial, because throughout history, some of the most controversial cases have demonstrated the danger of allowing assumptions to replace proof. Allegations require evidence, claims require verification, and suspicions, no matter how strongly held, are not the same as facts. As the Twisha case continued to unfold, those principles would become increasingly important. The public demanded accountability. The family demanded answers. The media demanded updates. But ultimately, the investigation could only be resolved through evidence. Not speculation. Not emotion. Not public pressure alone. The challenge facing everyone involved was determining whether the evidence could provide the answers that so many people were seeking. And as the nation watched closely, one reality remained unchanged. The case was still unfolding. The investigation was still active. And the most important questions had not yet been fully answered. For Twisha's family, the search for truth continued. For investigators, the search for evidence continued. And for the public, the wait for answers continued. But as the legal process moved forward, the case left behind a larger question. A question that extended far beyond a single courtroom. How does a society balance public demand for justice with the careful, deliberate process required to uncover the truth. That question would linger long after the headlines faded. And it remains at the heart of the Twisha case today. As we reach the end of this chapter in the Twisha case, one thing becomes clear. The story is not over. A young woman lost her life. A family continues searching for answers. Investigators continue examining evidence. And the courts continue weighing the facts. In the weeks and months ahead, new findings may emerge. Additional evidence may be presented. Questions that seem impossible to answer today may eventually find resolution. Or perhaps new questions will take their place. That is often the reality of complex investigations. The pursuit of truth is rarely straightforward, it is rarely fast, and it is rarely as simple as the headlines suggest. The Twisha case has become more than a criminal investigation. It has become a reminder of how justice is supposed to work. Not through assumptions, not through rumors, and not through the loudest voices in the room, but through evidence, through scrutiny, and through a process designed to separate fact from speculation. For Twisha's family, the search for answers continues. For the legal system, the responsibility remains the same, to follow the evidence wherever it leads. And for the public, the challenge is to remember that every headline represents real people whose lives have been permanently changed. Perhaps the most important question is not whether the case attracted national attention, or whether it dominated news cycles. The most important question is whether the complete truth will eventually be uncovered, because justice is not measured by the number of headlines a case generates. It is measured by whether the facts are ultimately revealed. And until every question has been answered, the Twisha case remains an open chapter. A chapter still being written. A chapter is still being examined. And a chapter that many people hope will one day provide the clarity they have been seeking. And as always, we leave the final judgment to the evidence. If you found this investigation informative, consider subscribing to Shadow Case Files for more evidence-driven true crime documentaries. Leave a comment below and tell us. Do you believe the court's decision to authorize a second post-mortem was necessary to ensure transparency, or do you think the original findings should have been considered sufficient? Your perspective matters, and respectful discussion helps keep important cases in the public conversation. If you value factual reporting over speculation, support the channel by liking this video and sharing it with others who appreciate serious investigative storytelling. Until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and remember, sometimes the biggest mystery is not what happened. It's whether the full truth has been discovered. Every case leaves a shadow, and every mystery deserves a voice. This is Shadow Case Files.